Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is the Our Turf Football Podcast. I am Dana O'Gorman. That is Sonia Greenfield. We are waiting on our guest and our third host. Everybody's running behind today, people. That's just kind of the way it works. And that's okay, right? Because we, it's just that time of year. Like, people are late. They got stuff to do. Lisa got stuck at work. It happens. But you know what? We are here with you. We are here with you right now. And we're excited because the funny thing about what's going on right now with, the drafts and the mock drafts and all these visits. I mean, every day we're posting like visit after visit after visit of all these players. It's all just building up, right?
Right.
But what does it really mean? That's what I'm really curious about. So, you know what? Let me bring on our guest. Jeff just got in there. There's Jeff. Everyone, this is Jeff Simmons, real Jeff Simmons on Twitter. You guys know him. If you follow me at all over on Real Hawk Talk, you know Jeff from there. And so, Jeff, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I'm excited. I like to have Jeff on the show over here because it gives he and I and everyone else a chance to talk about all the teams, whereas on Real Hawk Talk, we just talk about the Seahawks most of the time. So I'm excited, Jeff. I really appreciate it. I was just saying that it's such a buildup, and there always is so much hype, and the media is all wrapped up in who is where and what they're doing and this visit and that visit. But then you see the side little note. It's like, oh, by the way, he's doing 11 team visits. Like, so it doesn't really mean anything. It drives me crazy. Sonia, do you think that those team visits really have any impact on drafts?
Not really. I think they might just a little bit. I mean, I think sometimes if they're kind of in between a couple players, sometimes that last visit will like solidify either yes or no. Mm-hmm. But overall, sometimes it's just practice.
Right. Absolutely. Well, and I think that one interesting thing is I heard is that a lot of times these players are like, I didn't even talk to this team after they were drafted by them. Like, you hear that a lot. Like, there's players like, did you have a pre-draft visit? Nope. Never even talked to this team at all. Jeff, all these visits that are coming down and coming through, all of these players, the media tends to grab them and run with them. But I just think it's just due diligence, really.
Yeah, a lot of it is. A lot of it is at the combine when you're meeting with players, they're going through it's almost like speed dating. And they're going through so many interviews, and you don't sometimes get a feel for players that teams have said in the past that players can prepare for, and they can almost fake it. Mm-hmm. And when you're meeting with teams, it's purely due diligence. It's a great way of putting it. For a quarterback, for example, you want to get them on the board and start running. And I know a famous story with the visits is the Patrick Mahomes story, where Matt Nagy, who was the OC at the time, actually tipped him off the day before about they're going to ask you about these plays because he wanted him so bad. He wanted to impress Andy Reid. So a lot of the times they're doing things like that. And sometimes it's character issues. Sometimes it's a medical thing. So sometimes they might have a medical grade they get at the combine. They want to check something out. With someone like Jalen Carter, who we're probably going to talk about a bit later, I imagine it's going to be a lot more character driven. So it's not like sometimes teams do it and you'll see they'll draft a bunch of guys they brought in for visits. And sometimes they're doing it honestly to get info on teammates and other players. So it can be a whole lot of different things. Definitely some teams are big on smoke screens. And some teams just don't really care, and they'll visit with guys who are closer to the undrafted level to get more info on those guys, to get a heads up on those guys. So I'd say you're right, though. The number one thing you're probably looking at is due diligence, whether it's character, things on the board, or sometimes you can work a player out that you can't really do at the combine one-on-one.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, and I wonder, too, if you could have more in-depth conversations. Like there's not all the stuff going on, all the distractions, or kids have settled down a little bit from the combine. And so it's you get kind of a better, read of them. Or let's talk about Jalen Carter for a minute. He had a lot of stuff going on, right, during the combine. And then we turn around and he had a horrible pro day. And so these visits seem to be a chance for the teams to go, what's up with this? You know what I mean? What's happening, here. So that's really interesting to me to see kind of how that plays out. So we want to talk about defense a little bit tonight, right? We wanted to talk about these top defensive players. We want to talk about some sleeper defensive players because now Lisa's coming. I want people to know Lisa's coming because Lisa and I fight about defense all the time. She's a quarterback girl. She loves her quarterbacks. So we did not exclude Lisa from the defensive conversation. But what's that?
I said she just didn't want to talk.
Right. She just had to be held back at work. But so, but I want to talk about defense because we're going to talk a lot about quarterbacks later in the season because there's a very high expectation for 3 of them to go in the top 5, if not the top 6. Like they're going to go boom, 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 out the door they go, right? So then it really leaves you with a couple of other defensive players. And I think that if we talk about the top 5, I think most you have to start with Will Anderson. Am I right, Jeff? You have to start there. Is there any chance that he goes in the top 2, or do you think it will be quarterback? Because I'm waiting for a surprise. Like I really want a surprise.
I don't think there's a huge chance, but Peter King brought it up in his Monday Morning Quarterback article this week that Houston's picking 2, D'Amico Ryans has a defensive background, and they have a second pick from the Deshaun Watson trade at number 12. So if they weren't like super high on a Stroud or Stroud or Bryce Young, and they want to take Will Anderson there and then move up to get a quarterback, I guess it's a possibility. I don't see it. I think everything is going to be, but Will Anderson to me is just like the best bet of anyone, even including the quarterbacks. Dana, you'll like that.
Yay!
So I think he's the best bet of any player in this draft. I think he's not only like, if the draft was a year ago, if he was in the draft a year ago, he would have been number 1 pick. Travon Walker from Georgia went to Jacksonville, and the year before, he was the best player in college football. Like defensive players don't win the Heisman, and they almost never do. But it's just in terms of like the guys who went last year, Aiden Hutchinson, Travon Walker, Anderson was far better than them that last year he was in college. He took a little bit of a step back, but a step back, he had like 17 sacks or something. So a step back for him is not that big of a deal. And not only that, the thing about him is you don't often hear like guys like Nick Saban gush about his players. He's so monotone. He's kind of a hard ass. He's tough on players. If you listen and talk about Will Anderson, he just gets giddy. Like his energy in the film room, apparently, and his energy in practice and the way he like competes on game day, he is a guy who gets Nick Saban, a guy like that, giddy. And so he's got apparently elite like football character. I don't mean off the field stuff. I mean just like the kind of teammate he is, his X's and O's knowledge. And a lot of those Alabama, I've talked to Dana about this on their show. A lot of the Alabama guys that have come out in the draft on defense, even on offense, but on defense specifically, a lot of them have hit. So there's guys like Quinnen Williams and Minkah Fitzpatrick, especially in the last like 5 or so years. There's almost no busts. And so Will Anderson, who's been like their blue chip pass rusher, he might not be like the Myles Garrett in terms of like the freaky athlete. He didn't run the best 40 time. Myles Garrett is one of the freakiest athletes we've seen in the draft.
He's my dream Seahawks player. God, I want him in Seahawks.
He's a freak. He's got everything you want. He's like what you build in a lap.
Yeah.
He's not there athletically, but just in terms of like production, in terms of like betting on a person, to me, he's as clean and as good of a bet as you can make.
So our good friend Emery Hunt, obviously he puts out a draft guide every year. In my opinion, it's the best draft guide out there. It's so easy to navigate. And so I always put in a plug for him because I use it. I look these players up through him. I love his scoring system. And honest to God, he does strengths and he does areas of improvement. He has like a list of strengths, one little area of improvement. That should tell you everything you need to know, right? And he's the highest graded defensive end in there at a 90. His scouting grade is a 90 for him. It's what's interesting. He's the one everyone is talking about. He's the one we're all hoping, drops to your team wherever it will be. If you're not in the top 4 or 5, it's not going to happen. But he's the one everyone wants. So I want to, because most people know him. They also know Jalen Carter. So Sonia, I want to ask you, did your opinion or thought of Jalen Carter, the player, change at all after all of the stuff that he went through pre-combine?
Not pre-combine. Honestly, I'm going to go ahead and say that at his pro day, that's when I think everything kind of changed, because okay, there's going to be that legality stuff, and while it is important, and it is very much so important, we got to kind of let that play out. But I think the pro day gave us a chance to really see and let him kind of polish up his act and really put his best foot forward, and that didn't happen. So I think that was probably my biggest ding on the guy, on Mr. Carter, was that that his pro day was not the best. So that's where I kind of knocked him down some points.
Yeah. What about you, Jeff? I know we've talked about this a little bit, but I'm still in on Jalen Carter. If Seattle were to pick Jalen Carter at 5, I'd jump up and down for joy. And I know there are a lot of people who do not feel that way.
It's a really tricky evaluation unless you're a team and you're going to meet with him. And he's a guy I imagine all the top 10 are going to meet with. But with him, his talent is pretty unbelievable. He does things that just no one else in this draft can do. And like the interior defensive linemen, the pass rushers from the inside, if you look at like how many good edge rushers there are versus how many good interior guys, and like you've seen what Aaron Donald can do. Obviously, he's not Aaron Donald, but guys like him and Chris Jones, who was the best player in probably the Super Bowl last year. You see what he can do. Those guys are just rare. But the problem with Carter, it's hard for me to have like a full opinion because I don't have the full scope. It's exactly what we were talking about before. There's a lot of stuff off the field there. And I know there was the arrest at the combine, and that's well publicized at this point. But there are questions about at Georgia, like, is he the kind of guy who comes to practice every day? Is he the kind of guy who loves football? And when he comes in the combine and the pro day especially is one of the biggest job interviews of your life. And obviously he was probably going through a lot mentally after what happened with his teammates and the legal issue and all that stuff. And a lot of people shed weight for the combine. So sometimes people blowing up right after can be misleading, but it really, with him, it depends on each team has scouts, they have security. It really depends on whether you clear this guy or not. And there are going to be teams that don't have him on their board. But for me as a fan, I don't have that full scope. Even like I do shows, we don't have that full scope of information. So it's hard to have like a full, like, I'm out on this guy. I'm not going to say that. People make mistakes. And if my team is willing to draft him, I'm going to get excited about him very fast. But there are definitely concerns. And they're real. There was a thing at Georgia where people didn't know which day he was going to actually come and like show up. Like not physically show up, but like, is he going to come and try hard today at practice?
Yeah.
And he's the guy who had some conditioning issues at college. He's a guy who only played like 60% of the snap they've had. And that's not something that can be fully knocked on him for. They had a bunch of guys drafted in the first round last year that he played with. So they had a rotation going. So he's never really built himself up into that. But he's a guy that's a concern. Can he play a lot more snaps at the pro level? And at the pros, the thing Todd McShay says is when you go to the NFL, you have a lot more time. You don't have school anymore. You make a lot more money. And how is he going to handle that? And like we saw, like Albert Hainsworth, that might be like an old school name drop.
Nice.
He was a guy once he got paid, he became a totally different player. He was a dominant player for the Tennessee Titans, then went to Washington and got paid and didn't care. Fell apart. It's a cautionary tale now. And people have made that comparison. Some people have made the Warren Sapp comparison. He's a guy who got in some trouble at Miami and he fell in the draft and he was a dominant Hall of Fame, once in a lifetime defensive tackle. So it could be either of those scenarios. So I wouldn't say I'm out on him, but there are concerns and they're very, very real. It just matters whether your team is willing to pull the plug there.
Yeah. All right. So it looks like Lisa is here with us now. Hello, Lisa. Can you hear us?
Woo, I can hear you.
Lisa, can you hear me? Okay. Lisa came flying in. Lisa, often, Jeff, you'll understand this, will have some internet issues. Just so you know. So she does. But all right, Lisa, you're kind of popping in now. But we just got done talking about Jalen Carter, just so where you're at. What about your opinion on Jalen Carter? Do you even care because he plays defense? Just asking.
Oh, Georgia boy. The big Georgia boy. Yeah, I mean, it just depends how he transitions too. I mean, it could come out. I mean, it's that Georgia line is stout. I mean, it's, you watch film on him, you watch film on the kid. He's to me, he's the real deal. I definitely think he's going to be top 5. I honestly think he'll be the first defensive player off the board. So
I hope so. Because that means Will Anderson.
Oh, look at you.
Anyway,
so you need a
I know.
quarterback. What are you talking about?
No, I don't. Oh, Jeff, just so you know, Lisa hates Geno Smith. So we just got.
I don't hate him.
You do too. You hate Geno
No, I
Smith.
don't.
You know it.
I don't hate him.
He thinks he's mediocre. Anyway, okay. So we're not talking about quarterbacks today. We're not talking about quarterbacks.
We're talking
today,
about
Lisa.
defensive
Can't make
players.
me. So, Jeff, if we take out our bias and who we would love for those players, those two players, Will Anderson and Jalen Carter, to fall to, let's put it that way. Really, what scheme? No, you can't have him at the Lions. Don't forget it. What team do you actually think they will end up playing for? You've done 1,000 mock drafts. You must have an idea.
If I had to guess, I'd probably guess Arizona takes Will Anderson. I think Arizona should trade out. I don't know if you've seen their Cardinals roster. It is awful. It is worse than probably the Texans roster right now. And Kyler Murray's going to be out. They lost J.J. Watt. They lost Chandler Jones the year before that. Zach Allen got paid like $15 million a year by Denver. They have nothing on the defensive line. So they probably should take Will Anderson. I don't know if they will. They might trade back. They have a new GM. So I'll save that for now. Jalen Carter, I get the feeling the Seahawks aren't going to take him. I get the feeling they're going to be scared off based on past scars. So I'll say he ends up with the Philadelphia Eagles, and everyone looks back and it's like, how the hell did we let that happen again?
Well, the Eagles lost quite a few players this year, so they're looking to rebuild with them youth too. So that makes sense. Absolutely. All right, Sonia. So we really people talk, those are the top two players, really defensive players. Who rounds out your top five, do you think?
Shoot.
I
was going to say, oops, my bad. So who rounds out my top five?
Or even your next one, whoever it is.
I would say probably Brian Brees out of Clemson as well.
Okay.
I don't know. I just kind of have thought that he might be kind of one that not necessarily, well, yeah, people are going to talk about, but he's obviously not Will Anderson or Jalen Carter, but somebody who I think does deserve some love. So I think that, he probably would be a good one to look at too, at number 2. I wouldn't be mad if the Lions took him. Just saying.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on Brian, Jeff?
Sorry, I cut out Brian Branch.
Yeah, Brian Branch or Brian
Branch.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm sorry.
Oh, Brian Branch is one of my favorite players in this whole draft. Mm-hmm. And he's kind of in a weird spot where he's listed as a safety. And he's really a nickel corner. But in the NFL, the way it's going now, I probably sound like a nerd, but it's going a lot more like nickel defenses where teams are having 3 wide receivers on the field and become way more of a passing league. So like the nickel cornerback is a really, really valuable spot in the field. And Branch is a really good nickel player and could play safety. And like sort of like Minkah Fitzpatrick, I mentioned before he came out of Alabama, he was a little more of a better coverage player than Branch is, but Branch is just like really good at coverage, and he's like an awesome tackler. He's a little smaller, and he's not super fast, but he's just good at everything. And like guys from Alabama that have come out that are versatile, that can play in different spots, those guys just tend to hit in the NFL. And Branch is just one of those guys that kind of reminds me of Minkah Fitzpatrick, where you can kind of move him around to defense. He's versatile. He can play in tons of schemes. Like he's like the kind of guy I just can picture like a Baltimore or a Pittsburgh drafting and him being awesome at the next level. Pittsburgh has Minkah right now, so maybe not them, but I just see him as a team that like one of the smarter teams will take, and someone like the teams picking at the bottom will like overthink they didn't run a good 40, and that will be like, how the hell did this guy end up on that team again? And sort of like Minkah Fitzpatrick and Ed Reed fell in the draft. He wasn't drafted until like the 20s. So guys like that always get overlooked, and safety is his listed position is like not as valued as some of the other positions, but if you're a nickel defense, this guy's going to be a weapon, and I would want him. He's the kind of guy I would just want on my team, no matter what team I ran.
So Max in our chat says, if the Eagles lose Hargrave and wind up with Carter next to Davis, look out. I agree. I have a feeling that there are going to be teams that are real pissed they didn't pick up Jalen Carter. I think that you're right. So in the draft guide, Emory agrees with you. He has him listed actually as the number 1 slot cornerback. And so he thinks that that's a good position for him to be in. He's really impressed with that also. Lisa, what defensive do you like any defensive players?
Look at the struggle face.
I know. She just can't hack it.
She's like, I just,
I can't hear you, honey. are you muted?
You're muted, babe.
I don't think she is muted.
I did. I muted myself. I'm sorry. Let's try to take some aspirin. A little headache going on. Talk about defense. My head's going. Yeah. No, I think what Jeff hit right on the head was you look at the defenses now compared to the defenses we're looking at. We always joke about defenses and offenses. We always talk about defenses win championships. And I agree to extent in the 70s and 80s. I think now that's out the door, because I think now the defense that won championships to me are the defenses of the 70s and 80s that stopped just basically the running back and your traditional offenses. Now that you've gone to a spread, and I remember watching the Seattle Seahawks, and I'll use y'all's team as a thing. I remember that single high safety in that one game. I couldn't watch it. It probably wasn't Pete. It was your defensive coordinator at the time. The Seattle Seahawks defense that year always had a single high safety set almost 20 yards from the line of scrimmage. Yep. Do you guys remember that?
Oh,
mean, that always stood out in my mind because they always went to it. It's like, look at the Seattle's defense. That safety was a mile from the line of scrimmage. Mm-hmm. and I always laughed because I was just like, to me, that was the turning point of when we go to the spread, when you stop the offensives now, because now it's speed. Remember, we used to want the big guys up top. Now we want speed because you got to get pressure on the quarterback, and you got to get the pressure on the quarterback quick. Because with these offenses, and look at Miami, look at Mike McDaniel's offense. It's speed. You got 5 rides, you got 2 tight end sets, you got you're throwing the ball all over the place. So when you look at Branch, I liked Branch. I think he does remind you a lot of Fitzpatrick when you look at him. Mm-hmm. I think he can play both positions. I think he'll line up with the best of them. He'll go man on man. Mm-hmm. I have no idea. Another one is Emerald Forbes. I kind of liked him. I think he's I think I want size now in my cornerbacks with my wide receivers, except for your slot. You go slot, I think you can get a smaller guy. But when you go on these edges with these guys, you need a big cornerback. And there's some pretty good, decent sized cornerbacks in this draft that have speed. Yeah. So, but I like Branch. I thought, yeah.
So Sonia, I cannot believe she called Mike McDaniels by his real name. You know the rule here, Lisa.
Hipster.
His name is Hipster Homebrewer, and that's just what we call him.
Hipster Homebrewer.
Hipster Homebrewer. That's what he is. Jeff, who rounds out your top 5? So we have Carter, we have Anderson. We hear a lot about Wilson. What are some of the players that you like as your top 5?
So Branch would have been one of them. So I don't want to spoil that since we already got into it. And Lisa's right that there's a lot of good cornerbacks. Mm-hmm. And I think there's 2 guys who would probably be in my top 5 that are corners. And one of them is Christian Gonzalez from Oregon. He is just like kind of the guy who's like built in a lab. He's tall. He's got crazy long arms, and he can run. And yeah, you want to draft typically defensive linemen, pass rushers, more of the impact defensive players. And a lot of teams have had success finding corners later, but we saw Sauce Gardner last year, what he did. And this guy, Gonzalez, is probably not Sauce Gardner in terms of like the physical nature, but this Christian Gonzalez is just really smooth, if you know what I mean. He's big and he can run with guys. And there's been we saw what Miami's doing with Ramsey and Xavier Howard, and we've seen there's some really smooth corners in the league right now. And I think Christian Gonzalez, in a game where some of the defensive linemen they're going to be betting on in this draft are projects, Christian Gonzalez is a guy I think you can just drop into a defense and it's going to be a day 1 starter, and he can run. Like AJ Terrell in Atlanta, he's a guy who's he was picked in the middle of the first round a couple years back. He's just been hit the ground running. He reminds me a lot of him. And he's bigger and he's faster. And I think he's a really good player. Tyree Wilson's a really interesting player. He goes sometimes 5, high as the top 5. Lance Zierlein put him number 2 in his mock draft today. Wow. That is very rich for me. Mm-hmm. But he reminds me a lot of like Aldon Smith when he came into the NFL. So I don't know if you've seen Tyree Wilson stand next to some of his teammates. He looks like he's from another planet. Honestly, there's one picture of him. We're standing next. He played at like a Big 12 school, which is not one that produces a lot of defensive talent. The Big 12 is all offense. Tyree Wilson has like the longest arms. Like his wingspan is comparable to like Giannis Antetokounmpo's from the NBA. Like you watch him go like this, like he looks like he's from another planet. He might be one of the most powerful. And if he was a guy, he hurt his foot at the end of last year. If he went through this whole combine workout cycle, this guy would have generated a crazy amount of hype because he would have been one of those workout warriors. So when you watch the guy play, he's like a physical, like there's not a lot of people just like him coming out of college. He's built like a man, and he just looks totally different. He's not like the explosive, twitchy athlete. That's probably the one thing that he's not going in the top 5. Because guys like him, the way that they're built, typically go in the top 5. A defensive lineman that with super long arms, super athletic, but he's not like crazy fast off the edge. He's more of a power player. So he's probably rounds out like closer to the bottom of my top 5 because he's more of a project. He doesn't have a lot of like refined pass rush moves. He just bull rushes people over. And if you get him with the right coaching staff, you put him with the right coaches that could teach him how to be a pass rusher. And Aldon Smith was kind of like this coming out of Missouri. He went to San Francisco and he had Justin Smith in front of him. He just hit the ground running. He was an instant dynamo. He fell out of the league for other reasons, but his rookie year, he was one of the best players. And I think if Tyree ends up with the right team, he's a guy I think could crush it. But again, he's still a bit of a project. He's not a typical, like he's not like Nick Bosa coming into the draft where he's just a refined pass rusher with like dominant hands and all these things. He's a lot like Travon Walker last year, who went first overall. He's an athletic freak. But you saw Travon, he had an up and down rookie year. He had times where he struggled. There were times where he flashed and he did things physically that just other people can't do. I think Tyree is a lot like that. So I said before Will Anderson would go over him. I think Will Anderson should go over him in this draft. So the 5th guy, I said Branch, they'd probably be on there, but I already talked about him, so we'll change it up. The 5th guy would probably be another corner, Devin Witherspoon, who's not like
you're gonna go pedigree.
He's not like the guy I mentioned before who's like the big, smooth, perfect athlete that you would build in a lab. Devin Witherspoon's scrappy, tough. He's a tackler. So people who love like hard-hitting corners, this guy is your guy. He's all around the ball. He's feisty, and he's a guy who got a lot better last year. So he's a guy whose best football might be ahead of him. And he's a guy like someone like the classic defensive coaches like a Mike Vrabel or a Belichick. They're going to love this guy. He is like an X's and O's guy. He's a grinder, and he's a guy that just plays hard-nosed football. And we've seen some corners do that at this level that have just been really, really good. And I think some teams – he's a guy who could go in the top 10. I think he could be the first corner drafted because some team I think is going to fall in love with this guy. And, again, he's not the best athlete. He's not the fastest runner. But when you watch his film, it's so much fun. Or watch his highlights even. Put on his highlights. He does things that just corners typically don't do in terms of hitting, in terms of being around the line of scrimmage. And he can run and cover. So he's not just like a hitter that can't run in coverage, and we've seen some of that happen in the last few years. But I don't want to talk about it. But he can do the whole thing. So he's not an athlete typically go first, which is why a lot of people think it'll be Christian Gonzalez. But I wouldn't be surprised if this guy jumps him.
Yeah. Lisa, I'm going to get to the player that you talked about here, but I want to put this comment up first. This is from Peter. It says, and it's a Seahawks specific question. So let's go ahead and get it in. So it says, since Ryan Neal officially signed with the Bucks, should the Hawks consider trading back and picking up Gonzalez? It sounds like you'd be all right with that, Jeff.
Definitely.
It's not I love Gonzalez as a player. I think if I'm the Seahawks, they need defensive linemen, and they're thin in terms of numbers. In terms of they only have 2 interior defensive linemen right now because they're basically out of money. And
they are.
2, they've had a lot of success finding corners, them more so than other people in the middle of the draft. So I don't know if that's what I would do personally, even though I really like Gonzalez. If I was another team, I would absolutely draft him. But there was a lot of chatter last year. The Seahawks did want to draft Derek Stingley. They didn't think Charles Cross would fall to them. And they probably would have taken a corner a lot higher than people have expected. But I wouldn't be upset if they trade back and got Christian Gonzalez again. I think he's really, really good.
Yeah.
But for basically what they need to do, I think they can kind of get by with. They have Trey Brown there. They have other guys. I don't think that's the way I would try to build their team.
Lisa, sorry, Jeff. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, go ahead.
Lisa, who was the player you thought he was going to mention?
Well, I do want to. I want to hit off Jeff one here a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
The name that everybody kind of hits on, and I think we decided this as Dolphin fans when some of ours were talking about when we passed on Watts pedigree. Let's talk about Joey Porter Jr. for a minute. Let's talk about this guy, okay? When you look at this guy from his freshman year to his senior year, the guy's elevated his game every single game. I mean, every single year the kid's played. This senior team, to me, he went to an elite. I think you have to go pedigree sometime. You have to kind of think that this kid was bred for football. You look at Pops. So another name I just want to kind of throw y'all's way was his name. You're going to see his name, I think, one or two the first. I mean, this kid, he's a pedigree player. Mm-hmm. He's a big kid, 6'2". Talk about a hitter. He's and when you look at his stats with his senior year, he 10 games, 440 snaps this kid played, 24 tackles, 4 assists, 5 stops, 9 passes. His quarterback rating when he was targeted is 63.6. That's not bad, especially when you're talking what we were just talking about this. So another one I would kind of watch, game day would be him.
Jeff, do you know where he's slated to be drafted?
He's supposed to be somewhere between 10 and 16, somewhere in there. So probably the closer to the teens. He's right there with Gonzalez and Witherspoon. And a lot of people will have some of those guys in different orders. So I think he's right in there. He's not as fast as a runner as those guys, but it's in terms of like the complete package and someone you want to bet on. Man, like his dad was one of my favorite. He was just an just an ass kicker. He talked and he backed it up. And you look at some of these guys like Patrick Surtain Jr., like he's crushed it. The bloodline's right there. He's probably the best.
Pedigree, right? Pedigree.
Yeah.
Marvin Harrison Jr., another one who's going to be a top 5 pick next year.
Oh, for sure.
That guy's he's an incredible football player.
He's a freak. He's a freak of nature. He's just like his pops. I mean, I've watched tape on him. Everybody's got their sights set on that kid. If he stays healthy, he's going to be a top 10 easily.
Oh, yeah. I think he'd be top 3. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now we're talking offense.
So Porter's just like, there we go. I can go both ways. I can go both. Porter's like, he's a fun football player. He's tough. He's feisty. He knows the game inside and out. Like, he's someone who I think is going to go in the mid-teens in the first round, and teams are going to be really happy with that pick. And there's like a whole range where there's Philly, there's New England, there's Washington. They all kind of need cornerbacks. And I think that's a guy he slots in very cleanly, day one starter. I think he's a little the athletic thing is just a little short of those other guys, and that's why he won't probably go in the top 10. But again, there's a lot of good players in this draft, especially at corner. I think he's going to be he's a surefire first rounder, probably top 20. So
yeah,
he's a really good player.
Sonia, let's talk sleepers for a couple of minutes. Are there any like sleepers that you had in mind or you wanted to ask Jeff about?
Not really.
Okay.
I think my biggest one, because I always love my Michigan guys.
Yes, you do.
My guy Mozzie Smith. He did have some issues back in Ann Arbor, like right at the end. But I don't think that was gonna work out to be too much of a big thing anyway. But I always like to hear where you think he would go.
I love Mozzie Smith. He is.
He really does.
If you follow the Seahawks, they currently have no nose tackles. They cut their only one last week, and like we have gone so nerdy about Mozzie Smith. It's crazy, but he's just a fun player because he's not a typical nose tackle in terms of like those guys are just like big maulers. Those guys typically don't go early in the draft. You can find them like later in the draft. They're typically guys you can find in the middle of it. Mozzie Smith is a freak athlete. At that size, like 330 pounds, and he's a freak athlete. Bruce Feldman, who's with the Athletic now, does like a list every year for his biggest freaks in college football before the year. Mozzie Smith was number 1. Guys at that size that can move like that are rare. He's just kind of a strange player because he's so talented, but the production wasn't always there.
Right.
And maybe you think when he the pros with better with different coaching, and Michigan's got really good coaching on defense, but they're hoping that when he gets to the pros, he's gonna just hit. And like he has so much talent, and guys like that who can move at that size are just so rare. People think he's gonna end up slipping into the back of the first round, and I know there's been chatter about Dallas liking him. There's chatter about Buffalo. Guys who need big men who can move. They just aren't built like that typically. Typically, you see that there's a guy at Baylor named Siaki Ika, who's what the typical nose tackle looks like, and he's a massive man that can't really move well. He just eats up blockers. And that's
right.
typically what nose tackles look like. He's probably going to go like closer to the end of the second round because he doesn't have those movement skills that Massey Smith has. So Massey Smith, the guy that like certain teams, certain fans are just going to fall in love with because of the potential. Because if you watch him play in Michigan, you see flashes, but it's not – the production wasn't always there. And that's where people don't know. Is he just going to be one of those guys that always leaves you wanting more, or is he going to hit? So he's a really tricky prospect, and if you love that upside, people are going to fall in love with him. But you would like to see a little more production coming from him, and that's where –
right.
But again, Rashawn Gary came from Michigan, was a similar kind of player. He's just been an awesome player at the pro level.
I was about to say, he's been really good for the Packers. And, yeah, he was just so good. He's always got blocked and all that other good stuff. But that's another story for another day.
Yeah, he was a hot and cold player in college. And,
was though. That's so true.
Yeah. Okay. First, I have to say two things. Number one, Jeff, you don't know the rules, and I'm sorry, but we do not compliment Evil Harbaugh on this podcast. So we don't say those things on this podcast. I'm just kidding. We're running a little long on time, so I'm just going to ask you one question really quick, Jeff. Who is a sleeper that you think no one is like paying attention to? Maybe they're not. Maybe they're going to go higher than you think they're going to go. Like, who's the player or even two that you are like, pay attention here?
There's a couple guys I would say. One of them is a cornerback from Kansas State named Julius Brents. And he's a guy who played really, really well at the Senior Bowl. This is just a really deep cornerback group. It's not me to typically be talking about cornerbacks, but that's the strength of this draft class, this corner. And he's a guy that I'm not going to say he's Richard Sherman because that's crazy. Because he's a unicorn kind of player, but he has a lot of his kind of skill set where he's just big, fast, and he's really, really smart. And I think he's a guy that's going to be drafted a little later than he probably should be because of how deep we talked about three corners already in this top five. Branch could be a corner. He's a guy that could go in the second or third round and I think could be a really, really good pro. And he just has the tools, and he's a guy that's getting a lot better. And I think he's going to be a guy that could be really, really good. Another guy I'd probably say is there's a linebacker. There's a defensive end. He's more of a 3-4 end from USC. His name is Tooley. He has a Samoan last name. It's hard for me to pronounce it. But his first name is Tooley. I just call him Tooley. And he is a guy that I think is really ascending. He's a guy that's just like people rave about his football character. Again, he's more of a 3-4 end. So he's not like the flashy, like pass rushing kind of guy. He's just the kind of guy that you want on your team. He blows up plays on defense. He makes a lot of good stops. And he's a guy that I think is probably a second, day two kind of guy, could be a third rounder. But I think he's going to be a really productive player at the pros. And USC, if you watched them last year, they brought in Lincoln Riley. They were all offense. And so a guy like him kind of slips under the radar because every week is a shootout. And Dana, that's not your kind of football. There's no defense at all. Every game is like 138. So the defensive players in that conference sometimes go under the radar. And he's a guy that I just think is just like a guy who gets his face dirty, like good grinder kind of player. He's not the flashiest guy. People are going to fall in love with like those guys with upside that can pass rush. And he's not that. He's just like a good blue collar player. I think that's the way I describe him. So I think both those guys who are probably second round picks, maybe not the deepest sleepers, I think those are guys who could be better pros than they were in college.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. All right. 40 minutes.
Who was the Michigan guy that we talked about? Who was the Michigan?
Discuss that. No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Who was it?
Massey.
Yeah, Massey Smith.
See, I'm hearing Mike Morse's name.
Yeah.
I just keep hearing him. I don't hear him. I hear Mike Morris, and I thought about that when you said that. I think he's going to be a lot better NFL player than he was a college player. Mm-hmm. That kid just comes to my mind when I think about that, because watching his play, and if he can get with a good coach, a good defensive coach, I think that kid's somebody to keep an eye on as a sleeper pick to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's awesome. All right, 40 minutes. And Jeff, I promised I wouldn't keep you past 35. I'm so sorry.
Okay. I'm just trying to kill time until the draft. So this is great.
Right. And that's what we're doing. All right. So everyone, once again, probably a lot of you already know, Real Jeff Simmons on Twitter. He is on Real Hawk Talk with me and the rest of the Hawk Blogger crew every week. But give him a follow. And Jeff, we appreciate your time so much and your knowledge. You guys should be in this chat with these boys, and they post pictures and this, that, and this mock and blah, blah, blah. I learned so much from them. I love it. So, because
you'll be in the chat. You'll be in the chat.
I know.
You guys will be, with Geno Smith, you're going to be mid-pack every single year.
My
so
God, Lisa. Oh, I'm going to throw something at you.
So you'll be picking, 13, 14, 15 every season.
Yeah, so. I'm sure we will. Anyway, you got to come back for our quarterback, and we will fight about this in 2 adults.
Well, I want to come on that one.
Yeah, it happens. We'll be back for sure. So funny. All right. Well, thank you guys. Once again, we'll be back next Tuesday. Next Tuesday, we are talking about quarterbacks. Next week. God help us all. Maybe I'll skip that one. Kate can take that one. And we'll skip
no. All your Hawk Blogger friends are going to listen, because it's
they are.
Finish 8 and 9, you're going to be like, damn, we're mediocre again.
Stop it, Lisa.
Says the girl with Tua, who can't stay on the field. Okay, I'm not going to.
I don't hate him. I mean, I kind of like him. I mean, I'm happy for him. I really am. Don't get me wrong. I always want a player to be successful, but this is what you get. You're just
not talking about this with you right now.
But
we'll talk about it. We'll talk about that after the draft. How about that? After the draft, we will have one entire episode about Geno Smith without question.
We'll have Lisa break down why he sucks. Why?
But he is right. I mean, when in all seriousness, when you look at this defensive draft, it is one of the better defensive drafts we have definitely seen in the last couple of years. I'm going to tell you right now, as far as quarterbacks, as far as players are concerned, this is a very, very talented draft, especially with, like I said, with the way we see offenses going now. These defensive coaches, I remember when you used to do cornerbacks, you always used to say, God, he'd be a good special teams player too. Because remember, we always started our cornerbacks off of special teams.
Right. You're right.
Now it's like, oh, no. He's going to be we need that now. Because we're spread out a little bit more. We got, we got, 3 wide sets now. So you don't see a lot of these Sauce Gardners going on special teams anymore like we used to.
You're absolutely right. Yeah. I thought last year the defensive draft was impressive. This year it was good, but this year's even just so much more impressive.
It's gonna be fun. Especially like with you guys. I'm interested to see what the Seahawks do, because I think you've got a nice buffet set out in front of you.
Will Anderson, come on down. All right. What were you saying, Sonia?
Oh my gosh. I think this draft is stacked every which way you look at it. Like, this is a really stacked.
Wide receivers is a little iffy, but God, those tight ends, you got to talk about all those tight ends. I mean, it's just crazy.
So,
and we're going to talk about them all.
Yes, we are.
We are.
All in this next month. So it's going to be really great. You guys stick with us. Make sure you subscribe to our YouTube.
Smash that button. Smash it.
Smash that subscribe button. Talk to us during the show. We'd love to see that. But yeah, it's been a great show. See you guys next week, where we're talking quarterbacks. So Lisa, be ready. Okay.
I'm gonna call out if I'm scheduled. I'm calling out.
Okay. All right, you guys. See you next week. Bye.